Waiter girl called out in fancy restaurant. Millionaire shouts. Who's your mother? In a high-end restaurant nestled in the heart of Manhattan, where jazz melodies blend with the clinking of crystal glasses, a 13-year-old waitress named Lily weaves silently between tables, balancing a tray almost too heavy for her arms. She's small, unnoticed by the crowd of socialites and businessmen, until one motion changes everything. As she reaches to place a dish, her sleeve slips just slightly, revealing a star-shaped birthmark on her left wrist. At a nearby table, a sharply dressed man in his 30s, Ethan Cole, a young tech millionaire, goes rigid. His wine glass tilts, shatters on the table. Time seems to stop. His eyes lock onto that mark, wide with disbelief, as if he's seen a ghost. The color drains from his face. That birthmark. It's not just familiar, it's identical to the one his mother had. The mother who vanished without a trace 13 years ago. Stop, he suddenly shouts, his voice cutting through the music, startling the entire room. Who is your mother? The room falls silent. Everyone turns to look. Lily freezes, tray slipping from her hands, eyes wide, not knowing that in this moment, the past has come back, and it's staring right at her. In the middle of the Grand Oak, one of Chicago's most exclusive fine dining restaurants, conversations buzz like soft static, expensive laughter, forks clinking against porcelain, wine being poured into long-stemmed glasses. The room glows under amber chandeliers, every detail curated to perfection. And then, suddenly, everything stops. A man shoots up from his seat at table 7. Ethan Cole, billionaire tech investor, media darling, the kind of man who doesn't raise his voice unless the world's ending. But now, in front of the entire restaurant, he shouts, loud, raw, broken. Who is your mother? Every head in the room swivels. The piano player falters mid-note. Servers freeze mid-step. At the center of it all, a small girl in an oversized apron stands motionless, her hands trembling beside an overturned tray, shards of ceramic scattered at her feet. She's 13. Her name is Lily, and she has no idea what's happening. Ethan's eyes are locked on her wrist. The place where a birthmark had flashed like lightning just moments ago. Star-shaped, sharp-edged, impossible to forget. It's the same mark that lived on his mother's skin. The mother who disappeared 13 years ago without a trace. One day she was there, cooking breakfast in their townhouse in Brooklyn, humming along to Motown. The next, she was gone. No body, no note, only questions. Now here, in the most unlikely of places, that mark has returned, etched into the skin of a girl who shouldn't exist in his world. But somehow, the restaurant manager rushes toward them, already apologizing profusely to Ethan. But he raises a hand, eyes never leaving Lily. Don't take her away, he says firmly. I need to speak with her. The manager hesitates. So does Lily. She looks at the man with confusion, fear creeping into her features. I'm sorry about the tray, she whispers. I didn't mean to drop it. I'm not upset about the tray. Ethan says, softer now, but still intense. I just need to ask you something. That birthmark, do you know where it came from? Lily stares down at her wrist, then quickly pulls her sleeve down. I've had it forever, she murmurs. I don't know. It's always been there. Ethan steps closer, trying not to overwhelm her, but he can't stop the way his voice trembles. Do you know your parents? Anything about your family? She shakes her head. I was raised by Mr. Thomas. He says he found me, took me in when I was a baby. I don't know anything else. Ethan sways slightly, like the ground beneath him just shifted. The timeline matches. The location. Just a few hours from where his mother vanished. And now, this girl, this child who carries the mark he thought had died with his mother. I think you might be connected to someone very important to me. He says, my mom, she disappeared when I was 10. And that mark on your wrist, she had the exact same one. Lily's lips part. She looks like she wants to speak but doesn't know what words to use. The room is still watching, though now murmurs rise among the diners. Phones are out, someone is filming, but for Ethan, nothing else exists except this girl and the roaring storm inside him. You said Mr. Thomas took you in? He asks. Do you know where he found you? She nods hesitantly. He says, I was left near a farmer's market, wrapped in a coat. He never told me much. Just that it was raining that day. And that no one else was around. Ethan pulls out his phone and taps quickly, swiping to a photo in his gallery. It's old, grainy, his mother in her 30s, smiling at the camera. On her wrist, plain as day, the same star-shaped birthmark. He holds it out. Lily peers at it, her face pale, her lips quiver. I've never seen her before, she says quietly, but I don't know why. She feels familiar. The manager clears his throat. Mr. Cole, if this continues, I'll have to ask you. She's coming with me. Ethan interrupts. I'll handle the consequences. I just need to talk to the man who raised her. Please. Lily looks up at him, searching for malice, for danger, but all she sees is something else entirely. Pain, desperation, maybe even hope, and something in her, something she's never fully understood, tells her to say yes. She nods. Ethan exhales for the first time in minutes. Then turns to the manager. I'll compensate the restaurant for everything, but tonight, I need to find out who this girl really is. Outside, the night has fallen, crisp and quiet, like the world knows something's about to change. The car engine hummed low beneath the quiet hum of Chicago's late-night traffic. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter than he realized, his knuckles pale in the dashboard light. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Lily, silent, cautious, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't said much since they'd left the restaurant. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick with something unspoken. Something rising. They drove down narrow residential streets, where city lights gave way to flickering porch lamps and cracked sidewalks. Finally, Lily lifted a finger. It's that one, she said softly, pointing to a small, one-story house nestled between two alleyways. The windows were dark. The wood on the front steps was old and worn, like it had seen more winters than it should have. Ethan parked and turned off the engine. He exhaled slowly, as if trying to prepare for something he couldn't name. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, pulled out a weathered photograph, and held it toward Lily. This is my mother, he said, voice low. Her name was Emily Cole. She vanished when I was 10. The police never found her. No signs, no leads. But this, he tapped the photo gently. This birthmark. It's identical to yours. Lily took the photo with trembling fingers. She stared at it for a long time. The woman in the picture was smiling, her arms around a young boy, Ethan, maybe 8 or 9 years old. But it wasn't the smile that caught her breath. It was the mark, a star-shaped birthmark on the woman's left wrist, identical in placement and shape to the one Lily had spent her life hiding under long sleeves. She didn't know this woman, but something about her felt familiar. Not in memory, but in the bones, in the blood. She looked up. Mr. Thomas is the man who raised me, she said. He never talked about my family. I don't know if he ever knew anything. Ethan nodded slowly. I think he knows more than he's let on. They stepped out of the car. The porch creaked beneath their weight. Lily knocked softly. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Finally, the door opened with a groan. A thin, older man stood in the doorway, white hair sticking out in every direction, a threadbare sweater hanging loosely on his shoulders. His eyes flicked to Lily, then to Ethan, then back again, slow and sharp, like a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. Lily? He asked, voice rough with sleep. You okay? She nodded. This is someone I met tonight. He says he knew his mother, and he thinks she might be connected to me. Can we talk, mister? Thomas stared at Ethan again. There was something in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or dread. He stepped aside. Come in. The living room was cramped, lit by a single yellow lamp, a beat-up couch, a stack of books, a clock that ticked just a little too loudly. Mr. Thomas sat slowly in his chair, motioned for them to do the same. No one spoke for a long beat. Then Ethan reached into his coat and placed the photo on the coffee table between them. Her name was Emily Cole. Ethan said, she disappeared 13 years ago. No one ever found her. But your girl, Lily, has her birthmark. Exactly. Same place. Same shape. Mr. Thomas didn't touch the photo. He stared at it, not blinking, not breathing. I was told Lily was found abandoned. Ethan continued. She said you took her in. Mr. Thomas finally leaned back and let out a long, exhausted sigh. I didn't find her, he said. She was left by a woman. Middle of a rainstorm. She was hurt bad, bleeding, barely breathing, but she was holding the baby, Lily, tightly, like nothing else in the world mattered. Lily's breath caught. She stared at the man who'd raised her. Who'd never told her this? You saw her? Ethan asked, his voice nearly a whisper. I did. Just for a second. I tried to help, but by the time I got to her, she was gone. Gone. She bled out right there, next to a produce stand. Nobody else around. I called it in. Cops came. Said there wasn't much they could do. No ID. Just the baby. I didn't have the heart to leave her at the shelter. So I took her home. He looked over at Lily. His eyes wet. You were so small. Could barely open your eyes. Ethan leaned forward. Urgency in every word. Did she have anything on her? Anything personal? Jewelry? Papers? Mr. Thomas nodded slowly. A necklace. Silver. Simple. Had a name engraved on it. He stood. Walked to a shelf. Reached behind a row of books. And pulled out a small wooden box. He opened it, carefully lifting a delicate silver chain with a round pendant. He handed it to Ethan. Ethan turned it over. His heart skipped. There it was. Emily. His mother's name. Etched into the metal. The chain trembled in his fingers. It's hers, he whispered. It's really hers. Lily stared at the pendant. Her fingers brushed the edge of it. And for the first time, tears slipped down her cheek, not because she was afraid, but because something inside her was beginning to fit. Like a piece of her identity was finally slipping into place. I think she's my mother, Lily said, her voice cracking. Mr. Thomas nodded. I think so too. Ethan looked between the two of them. I want to take her for a DNA test, he said. I'll cover everything. I just need to know. We both do. Mr. Thomas didn't argue. He just sat there, hands resting on his knees, eyes far away. I always knew this day would come, he said quietly. I just didn't know what it would feel like. That night, they left with the necklace, the photo, and a story that no longer belonged to just one person back at Ethan's apartment. High above the city skyline, the lights looked different to Lily. For the first time in her life, they didn't feel distant. She stood by the window, pendant in her hand, staring down at the streets that once seemed so far away. Ethan watched her from across the room. He saw his mother's eyes in hers. Her quiet strength, her uncertainty, her resilience. Are you scared? He asked gently. Lily turned. A little, she admitted, but not as much as before. He smiled softly. No matter what the test says, you're not alone anymore. She looked back out at the city. Neither are you. And in that quiet moment, two lives that had been orbiting around a missing truth for over a decade finally collided, with a pendant, a birthmark, and a question that would soon have an answer. The small living room smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of scent that clung to the past and never left. Ethan stood in the doorway, his shoulders stiff, his breath held in a quiet anticipation he hadn't felt since the day his mother disappeared. Beside him, Lily hovered just behind, her arms crossed tight across her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. Across from them, Mr. Thomas sat in a worn-out armchair, the same one he'd probably owned for decades. His eyes, gray and deep-set, weren't as tired as they looked. They were cautious, calculating, like a man flipping through a mental ledger, trying to decide how much truth to spend and how much to keep. You're asking about things that don't belong to me anymore, he said finally, his voice rough and slow. Ethan stepped forward, placing the photograph gently on the old coffee table. The image stared back up at them, Emily Cole, smiling, the birthmark clearly visible on her wrist, her arm wrapped around a young Ethan. I think Lily is her daughter, Ethan said quietly. She was found 13 years ago. That's when my mother vanished. And Lily has that same mark, same place. And you? He looked up at Mr. Thomas. You're the one who found her. Mr. Thomas stared at the photograph a long while before he leaned back with a heavy breath. I didn't just find her, he said finally. I saw everything. Lily froze beside the couch. Ethan said nothing, just waited. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, as if pushing them all toward a truth that couldn't be avoided anymore. Mr. Thomas looked down at his hands, weathered and scarred from years of sewing and fixing clothes. Hands that had held secrets too long. It was raining that night. He began. Not the kind of rain you run through. The kind that drowns sound. Soaks into your bones. I'd just closed up the shop and was cutting through the back alley of the farmer's market on 58th and Elmore. Most people were already home. The lights were off in most stalls. But something made me stop. His voice lowered. I saw her. A woman. Lying next to a trash bin behind a fruit stand. Her clothes were soaked. And there was blood. A lot of it. But she wasn't alone. She was clutching a baby to her chest. Wrapped in a brown coat. Still breathing. Lily sat down slowly. Her legs suddenly weak. That baby was me? She asked. Barely above a whisper. Mr. Thomas nodded. You were barely 3 months old. Cold. Crying softly. But alive. He paused. Then looked at Ethan. I tried calling 911. I waited. But by the time help arrived, the woman had died. No ID. No phone. Just a silver chain around her neck. He reached over to a drawer beside the couch and pulled out a small wooden box. He opened it with reverence. Like opening a casket of buried time. Inside was a silver necklace. Tarnished from age but still intact. Ethan leaned in, hands trembling slightly. He took the necklace and turned it over. There it was. The name engraved on the back. Emily. His mother's name. Etched clearly in soft cursive script. His eyes closed for a moment. A wave of memories washed over him. Her laugh. Her hands brushing his hair. The way she used to hum old jazz songs while making breakfast. The pieces were lining up too perfectly now to be coincidence. Why didn't you tell anyone? Ethan asked, his voice laced with 1,000 unspoken things. Why didn't you say something? Mr. Thomas stared at the floor. Because I was afraid, he admitted. That wasn't a random attack. Someone had done that to her. Clean. Deliberate. No robbery. No signs of struggle. She was just gone. Left behind like garbage. But the way she held that baby, he looked at Lily. She wasn't trying to escape. She was trying to protect you. Lily blinked back tears. So you just took me in? Mr. Thomas nodded. They were going to send you to a shelter. You were crying. Tiny. And I couldn't walk away. I told the officers I'd watch over you until they figured out who she was. But no one came. No one claimed her. No one reported a missing mother with a baby. So weeks turned into months. Then years. And I raised you the only way I knew how. Lily looked away. Her jaw clenched. But you never told me. Not once. I didn't want you growing up with that image. Mr. Thomas said, voice shaking now. A baby left next to a dead woman in the rain. I wanted you to grow up safe. Normal. I thought if I never said it out loud, maybe it would fade away. Ethan stood up slowly, still holding the necklace. He stared at the chain as though it were a time machine. A confirmation. A wound. She didn't just disappear, he said, more to himself than anyone else. She was murdered. Mr. Thomas gave a slow nod. That's what I've believed for 13 years. I think. She was trying to get away from something. Someone. And she didn't make it. Ethan's grip tightened. My father told me she left us. That she walked out, took nothing with her, not even a goodbye. He made me believe she just abandoned me. Mr. Thomas looked up, something heavy in his expression. People like your father, they don't lose things by accident. If she ran, it was for a reason. Ethan's heart pounded. The pieces were crashing together now. His father's lies, the missing records, the hollow silence every time he asked about her. And now, this. A body. A baby. A necklace buried in a drawer for over a decade. Lily finally spoke again. Her voice was clear, but there was something broken behind it. So, I'm her daughter. I had a mother, and someone took her from me. Ethan turned to her, slowly, and knelt down so they were eye level. We'll find out the rest. He promised. But this, he held up the necklace. This proves you were loved. She didn't abandon you. She died protecting you. A tear slid down Lily's cheek. But she didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, quietly, like the rain on the night she was found. Mr. Thomas watched them both. Something like relief softening the tightness around his eyes. I always knew the day would come. He murmured. But I didn't expect it to feel like this. Ethan stood, slipping the necklace into his coat pocket. We're going to get answers. Not just for us, but for her. Lily nodded. For her. And in that dim little living room, where secrets had once been buried beneath silence and fear. The truth began to stir, finally. After 13 long years. Ready to come to light, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the abandoned lot on the edge of Southside Chicago. Overgrown weeds choked the remnants of an old marketplace. Rusted stalls barely standing, forgotten by time. Ethan stepped cautiously through the brush, his eyes scanning the ground like it might still hold echoes of a life once lived. Beside him, Lily followed quietly, her fingers gripping the silver necklace like it was her only anchor. "This is where she was found," Ethan said, voice low. "Right here, behind one of these fruit stands." They moved slowly, carefully, until Ethan suddenly stopped and crouched. Half buried in the dirt was a glint of metal, a small silver ring. Weathered, but unmistakable, his hands trembled as he picked it up. "It's hers," he whispered. "She used to wear this every day." Before Lily could respond, a rustling sound came from behind. 3 men in dark jackets emerged from the alleyway, silent, coordinated, eyes cold. One of them spoke flatly. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan stood, shielding Lily instinctively. "We're not looking for trouble," he said, but the men kept coming. One reached into his coat. Without hesitation, Lily darted behind Ethan and pulled out her phone, hitting the emergency dial she had pre-programmed earlier. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She pressed record and stepped back. Steady. Sirens wailed in the distance, closer than expected. The men froze, exchanged glances, and scattered just as police cruisers swerved into the lot. Tires screeching. Officers jumped out, guns drawn, chasing after the fleeing shadows. Moments later, crime scene tape stretched across the lot. Forensics arrived, and as they dug beneath the soft earth near where Ethan found the ring, something surfaced. A human burial wrapped in plastic, undisturbed for over a decade. Alongside the remains were personal effects, a broken phone, scraps of clothing, and a second necklace that matched Lily's. Ethan stood in silence, staring down at the unearthed truth. Lily reached for his hand. For the first time, she didn't feel like a question. She felt like an answer, painful, unfinished, but real. The past had been buried in silence. Now it had a voice. The interrogation room was cold, metallic, and humming with fluorescent silence. On one side of the table sat Ethan Cole, his jaw clenched, hands folded tightly in front of him, eyes locked forward with laser focus. Beside him, Detective Ramirez watched silently, letting the weight of the room do its work. Across from them sat the man who had been lurking at the burial site, now stripped of his blazer and confidence. His wrists were cuffed, his knuckles bruised, his face unreadable, until Ethan pulled something from his coat pocket and set it gently on the table. The silver necklace, Emily Cole's necklace, still bearing her name on the back, still soaked in questions. "You were there," Ethan said, voice sharp but even. "We found you at the scene. You knew exactly what was buried there. And you were trying to keep us from digging. Now tell me, what happened to my mother?" The man didn't speak. His eyes flicked to the necklace, then back up, unflinching. Ramirez leaned in. "You're already facing obstruction, tampering with a crime scene. Maybe more if we link your prints to the grave. Talk now, or you won't get a deal later." Still silence. Then finally, a deep breath. The man leaned forward, voice low. "She was killed," he said. "Your mother, Emily Cole. She wasn't some random victim. She knew something she shouldn't have. And she was going to talk." Ethan blinked, his heart pounding in his ears. What did she know? The man smirked slightly, like the truth was both his curse and his shield. "She found out about her husband. Your father, Raymond Cole. He was running money through his companies. Fake charities, ghost foundations. She confronted him, threatened to go public." Ethan swallowed hard, the walls of his childhood crumbling with each word. "So he had her killed?" he asked, barely able to say the words. "No," the man replied. "Not directly. Powerful people never get their hands dirty. He made a call, and that call went to people like me." Ethan stared at him. Numb. Ramirez scribbled notes, but even he looked shaken. "And the baby?" Ramirez asked. "Lily?" The man's face softened for the first time. "We didn't know she was there. None of us. If we had, things might have gone differently. But the woman ran. She escaped the first attempt. Hid. Made it all the way to the outskirts before collapsing. She died holding her child. That baby was supposed to be collateral. But someone found her first. Ethan's breath caught. Pieces snapped together like glass. His father's strange detachment. The quick funeral with no body. The lies layered in wealth and grief. You buried the truth, he said. You let a child grow up without a mother. And you let me believe she walked away. The man said nothing. He didn't deny it. Didn't flinch. He just stared at the floor. As if haunted by a truth that had finally found its way back. Outside the room, through the two-way glass, Lily watched everything unfold. She couldn't hear the words. But she saw Ethan's face. Saw the way his shoulders tightened. The storm building inside him. And she knew. The man who built an empire had also buried a body. And now, the empire was cracking. The truth was out. And neither of them would ever be the same again. The results came in a plain envelope. The kind that didn't scream or whisper, just waited. Ethan stood in the hallway of the lab. His thumb pressed tightly against the sealed flap. Like tearing it open would unravel everything he thought he knew. Lily stood beside him. Her small hands clenched into the sleeves of her hoodie. Her eyes locked on the envelope. As if it held not just answers, but identity. With a single breath, Ethan opened it. His eyes scanned the document. And then, silence. He didn't speak. Didn't move. Just handed the paper to her. Lily took it slowly. Eyes darting across the bold black letters. DNA confirmation. 99.99% match. Subject Ethan Cole is the biological half-brother of subject Lily Thomas. Shared maternal lineage. The hallway seemed to tilt. Time bent. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Lily let out a soft, shaky breath. So it's real, she whispered. You're really my brother. Ethan looked at her, something raw flickering in his gaze. Yeah, he said, we're family. There was no dramatic hug. No violins swelling in the background. Just the shared recognition of a broken truth stitched back together. A name, a mother, a bloodline that no longer floated in limbo. And now, they had something else. Justice. That afternoon, Ethan stood in the grand marble foyer of his father's estate, once cold and immaculate. Now echoing with tension. The same man who taught him to tie a tie. To shake hands like a man. To smile for cameras and say nothing off script, stood on the staircase above. Graying, powerful, pretending the walls weren't crumbling. Raymond Cole looked down at his son. I assume you're not here for pleasantries, he said. Ethan didn't flinch. I'm here for the truth. He held up the necklace. Emily's, tarnished, still carrying the name she died with. This belonged to Mom. We found her body. We know what you did. For a second, Raymond's expression didn't move. Then his jaw shifted. The slightest break. It was never supposed to happen like that. He muttered. You have no idea what she was getting involved in. She was reckless. She was going to destroy everything. You mean she was going to tell the truth? Ethan's voice cut through the foyer like a blade. She found out you were laundering money. Using fake charities. She was going to expose you. And instead of facing it, you made her disappear. Raymond's fists tightened on the railing. You don't understand the cost of power, he said. You think truth wins? Truth doesn't build empires. Control does. You buried her, Ethan said, and you let me believe she abandoned me. You let a child grow up in a stranger's house without even trying to find her. That child is my sister. Raymond looked past him then, toward the doorway, where Lily now stood, quiet but unshaken. Their eyes met, and for the first time, he looked small, like a man caught not just by law, but by the very past he thought he'd erased. The sound of sirens reached them before the blue lights flickered through the glass. Raymond straightened his shoulders. You called them? He asked. Ethan nodded. She deserves to know what happened. And Mom deserves peace. You'll face this. As the front doors opened and officers stepped inside. Raymond didn't resist. He raised his hands. For once, the man who had pulled every string in silence, who had shaped his world with secrets, had none left to hold onto. He was led away. Down the same steps he once made Ethan climb in polished shoes. Now in handcuffs, outside. The air was different, not clean, not healed, but change. Lily stood on the porch beside Ethan, watching the police car drive away. Do you think it's over? She asked. Ethan shook his head slowly. No, But it's a start. She nodded. Then turned to him. You really didn't know about me? Not until that night at the restaurant. He said, but since then, I haven't stopped thinking about what we lost. And what we still have. She looked away. Eyes glistening. I never thought I'd have a family. Not really. Ethan smiled. A little broken but real. You do now, and together. They stepped off the porch. Not as strangers linked by tragedy, but as siblings bound by truth. Walking into a future no longer written by someone else's lies. The old house was quiet. Cloaked in the kind of silence that seemed to stretch across years. Dust floated in the sunlight slanting through the blinds. And the air was heavy with memory. Ethan and Lily sat across from Mr. Thomas in the living room. No longer strangers. No longer dancing around the past. The truth was out now. But some things, some silences, still needed breaking. Mr. Thomas stared at the floor for a long time. His hands resting on his knees. Eyes tired but steady. There's something I never told you, he said, voice rough like gravel. Not because I wanted to lie, but because I didn't know what would happen if I didn't stay quiet. Lily leaned in. Her brows drawn. Ethan didn't interrupt. Mr. Thomas looked at her then. Really looked and for the first time. There was something soft in his expression. Regret, maybe, or guilt, or something between the two. When you were little, he began, maybe 3 or 4, I noticed a man watching the house. Not just once, a few times. Different cars, same face. He didn't come close, didn't ask questions, just watched, and then drove away. Lily froze. You never told me that. I didn't want to scare you, Mr. Thomas replied, and I didn't know who he was. But I had a feeling, deep down, that he was looking for you. Or rather, for who you might grow up to be. Ethan leaned forward. Did you report it? Mr. Thomas shook his head. What would I say? That a man in a black sedan parked outside once a week? No plate numbers, no crime, just instinct. He paused. That's when I stopped taking you to the same park twice in a row. Changed your school once, kept you close. I didn't want to believe someone was still out there, still watching, but I couldn't take the chance. Lily sat back slowly, her thoughts spinning. All those strange moments from childhood, changing routines, being told not to talk to strangers. Mr. Thomas always picking her up on time, even when he was sick. So you weren't hiding the truth, she said. You were trying to protect me from it. Mr. Thomas nodded. That's the only thing I knew how to do. I didn't have the answers. I didn't know who your mother really was, or why someone might have wanted her gone. But I knew you were all I had left of her. And that had to be enough. He stood up then, walked over to an old bookshelf, reached behind a row of dusty paperbacks, and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. The edges were worn, the spine cracked. I've kept this all these years, he said, handing it to Lily. I found it in the coat she wrapped you in. I never read it. Not really. Just once. Years ago. Just enough to know it was hers. Lily opened it gently, her fingers tracing the faded ink. The handwriting was soft and looping, filled with careful emotion. The first page read, To my little star, if you ever find this, know that you were never abandoned. You were loved more than the world will ever understand. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. The pages were filled with tiny details. Dreams, hopes, warnings, memories from a woman who knew her time might be short, but still chose to leave behind something real. Ethan sat beside her, quiet, letting her absorb what had always been missing. She wrote this for me, Lily whispered. She wanted me to know who she was. Mr. Thomas nodded. I couldn't be your father, but I could be the man who kept her voice alive, even if it was locked away. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't empty this time. It was sacred, grief mixed with gratitude, pain softened by clarity. And in that stillness, Lily looked up at the man who had raised her. Not by blood, not by law, but by choice. You didn't fail me, she said. You gave me the one thing no one else did. Time. Time to be a kid before the truth had to come crashing in. Mr. Thomas looked down, eyes glassy, and managed a quiet nod. I just wanted you safe, he whispered, and finally, after 13 years of silence, he wasn't alone with the burden anymore. The street outside the police station was quiet, bathed in the soft amber glow of street lamps. The world had stilled. Just for a moment, like it knew something important had shifted. Ethan stood near the curb, his hands in his coat pockets, eyes staring blankly at the darkened skyline. Behind him, the heavy doors creaked open. Lily stepped out slowly, the DNA papers still folded in her hand. The journal of a mother she never got to meet clutched to her chest. She didn't say anything at first. Neither did he. The silence between them had transformed. It was no longer filled with uncertainty, but something new, something fragile, but real. Ethan finally turned to her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. He wasn't the billionaire anymore, not the public figure or the heir. He was just a man who lost a mother, found a sister, and was now trying to figure out what to do with both. "I'm sorry it took this long," he said quietly, "for us to find each other." Lily looked up at him, eyes glassy. "You didn't know." "Neither did I, but we're here now." She hesitated, just for a second, then stepped forward, her arms wrapped around him, tentative at first, then tighter, like something in her had finally unclenched. Ethan froze for half a breath, surprised by the sudden warmth, the weight of her head against his chest. Then his arms closed around her, protective, steady. It was the kind of hug that said more than words ever could. The kind that rewrote every lonely memory with the promise of something new. "I'll be here," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what comes next. I'll fight for her, for the truth, for you." Lily didn't answer. She didn't need to. In that moment, the past didn't vanish, but it no longer defined them. It stood behind them like a long, painful shadow dot, and for the first time, they faced forward. Ethan glanced up at the night sky, the stars faint but visible. "We'll rebuild," he said, "not just the truth, but the family we lost." Lily stepped back, wiping her eyes, and gave a small nod. Not everything was healed, not yet, but the foundation had been laid. Not in blood alone, but in choice, in forgiveness, in the promise of something stronger than silence. And as they walked down the sidewalk together, their steps in sync, they weren't just two people bound by tragedy anymore. They were brother and sister. And this was the beginning. The screen fades to a soft amber hue. Two figures walking side by side beneath the streetlights. Not saying much, but saying everything. Lily's hand clutches the journal of a mother she never knew, while Ethan's fingers rest lightly on her shoulder, as if anchoring her to something solid, something new. They've come through storm and silence, lies and loss, but somehow, through it all, they found each other, not by chance, not by blood alone, but by truth and choice. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't heal you immediately. It cracks you open. It hurts, but only when the truth is exposed can anything real begin. This isn't just a story about a lost mother, or a girl abandoned, or a man betrayed by the very family he trusted. This is about how, even in the dark, love finds a way to speak. And family, no matter how broken, can be rebuilt, piece by piece. If this story moved you, made you feel something, reminded you of the power of truth or the strength of family, we invite you to be part of our community. Hit that like button. Leave a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful, real-life stories that speak to the heart. Because sometimes, the stories that hurt the most are the ones that matter the most. And we're here to tell them. Together.